Sienna God, hello all. Osha, afternoon, good afternoon, Awado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 12, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Those who view slavery as an abstract moral issue are as disappointed with Lincoln today as William Lloyd Garrison was at the time. Garrison was dissatisfied with the language of the Emancipation Proclamation and with the fact that it did not decree, in quotes, total abolition of slavery, end quote. Sorry, I was making some folds in this because I want to make some short videos over it because it's freaking absurd. Anyway, so I'll reread that just in case it was too loud. Proclamation with the fact that it did not decree, in quotes, the total abolition of slavery, end quote, rather than just its abolition in the southern states at war. He seemed oblivious to the huge legal and political risks that Lincoln was taking, as many in later times would be when they criticized the limits of his actions and words. But had Lincoln's real concerns extended no further than the military effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, it would be hard to explain his many and strenuous behind-the-scenes efforts to get slaveholding border states and the Congress of the United States to extend the ban on slavery to the whole country. He wasn't just sitting back, y'all, okay? Garrison's rhetoric may look better to a later generation, but the cold fact is that William Lloyd Garrison did not free a single slave, while Abraham Lincoln freed millions. Put your money where your mouth is. Lack of awareness or concern for the context and constraints of the times is only part of the problem of those today assessing such historic figures as Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, or the American nation as a whole. No small part of the distortion and confusion about the history of slavery comes from attempts at scoring points about the past or using the past to try to extract concessions or largesse, L-A-R-G-E-S-S, in the present. Non-Western slaveholding countries, past and present, from whom no reparations or other concessions are even remotely to be expected, are passed over in silence by the most vocal critics of the West. Right? Scholars have long known that slavery was a worldwide institution going back thousands of years, though that has not led them to provide comparable coverage to slavery outside Western civilization. One scholar whose study of slavery encompassed Islamic as well as Western societies observed, in quotes, slavery has been a common feature of human history, appearing in nearly every part of the world, end quote, though his own study did not extend across the vast reaches of Asia or to the Polynesian islands. Another scholar distinguished for his studies of the Atlantic slave trade declared, slavery until recently was universal in two senses. Most settled societies incorporated the institution into local social structures, and few peoples in the world have not constituted a major source of slaves at one time or another. Despite such common knowledge among scholars, the version of the history of slavery more commonly depicted to the general public, as well as to the students in our schools and colleges, is more along the lines of roots or other similar productions. Exactly. On the other end of the spectrum, one of the rationales for slavery used in both ancient times and in more recent centuries has been that co-signing some people to perform the drudgery of the world freed others to pursue the higher things, education, invention, political leadership, the arts, etc., and thus advance civilization as a whole. Plato and Socrates came out of the slaveholding society, as did many of the remarkable leaders who founded the American Republic. But correlation is not causation, and even the correlation is not as clear as some apologists for slavery have assumed. Although Brazil imported several times as many slaves as the United States, y'all. It would be difficult to find Brazilian equivalents of Plato or Socrates or other world leaders in the advancement of civilization in the arts or sciences. The remarkable number of early American leaders who came out of Virginia, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, had no counterparts in the other southern states, which collectively had vastly larger numbers of slaves than those of Virginia. The South as a whole lagged far behind the North in producing leaders in the arts and sciences. Slavery has been too facile an explanation of both the positive and negative aspects of slaveholding societies. Absolutely. I mean, come on. If it was needed in order for other people to engage in education and all of that, furthering themselves and exploring things, how come people didn't come out of there that did such wonderful things for society, for the world, whatever I'm trying to say, that went down in the history books like that? You know? The idea that slavery was based on race or racism is yet another popular notion that will not stand up to scrutiny of history. As we have already seen, yet beliefs about the innate ability of blacks in the United States by prominent American leaders of an earlier era have been invested with great moral implications by those seeking to score points. But beliefs are neither moral nor immoral. They may be accurate or inaccurate, founded or unfounded, but they acquire more moral significance only when they are shaped to serve some ulterior purpose that is either moral or immoral. Belief in the innate equality of all people has been promoted in order to promote equal treatment of all people, and belief in innate inferiority has been promoted in order to justify discrimination against some people. Exactly. But it is these goals which have moral significance. In the absence of such goals, the beliefs themselves are subject to the test of evidence and logic rather than the test of moral principles. Abraham Lincoln, for example, said of blacks that their abilities were no measure of their rights. Thomas Jefferson likewise said, "Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on a par." Gosh, the way they spoke. Okay, I feel like I got to start over. I'm sorry. Thomas Jefferson likewise said, "Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on a par with ourselves. My doubts were the result of personal observation on the limited sphere of my own state, where the opportunities for the development of their genius were not favorable, and those of exercising it still less so. I expressed them, therefore, with great hesitation, but whatever their degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights, because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding. He was not, therefore, lord of the person or property of others." Exactly. That took the question of Jefferson's beliefs about innate ability of blacks out of the realm of morality. Elsewhere, Jefferson pointed out how tentative any conclusion must be about the innate ability of blacks, given the lack of scientific precision possible on such questions. And that goes right along with what I say. Like, you're not special, okay? So, just because you don't want to break a sweat doesn't mean that you're more special than somebody else. Like, you can actually break a sweat, you're just choosing not to. And you should not own people. Excuse me. We know that now, looking back at history and just the morality of it all, right? But we were not born in those areas. But nobody is better than anybody else. I mean, if you think you are better than somebody else, that just shows that your pride and ego need to be worked on, because literally we're all made in the image of Creator, and Creator does not discriminate. Although Jefferson has been criticized for having expressed doubts, what he called, quote unquote, a suspicion only about the innate ability of black people, his obvious pleasure at discovering the able work of Benjamin Banneker, Banneker, suggested that his beliefs were not the servant of some ulterior purpose. The vast majority of blacks that Thomas Jefferson saw were illiterate people whose development had been stunted by slavery. He never in his entire life saw a black man who had a college degree, because there were none. The first black man to receive a college degree in the United States did so 2 years after Jefferson's death, and the first black woman more than a quarter of a century after that. As Jefferson himself realized, his observed sample of black people was inherently biased by time and space, which is an empirical deficiency of his circumstances rather than a moral choice of his own. Others, however, used their belief that blacks were innately lacking in ability to justify, for example, forbidding the teaching of blacks. Frederick Law Olmsted's response to the claim that blacks were no more capable of being educated than animals were was to ask why there were no laws forbidding animals from being educated. Excuse me. The very need for such a law undermined the belief that was to justify that law. Again, the moral significance of a belief derives from the purpose to which it is put. Otherwise, there is only a question of assessing the logic and evidence behind the belief. While facts about slavery are essential, we need more than facts. Indeed, one of the principal uses of facts is to gain some sense of causation, some explanation of why history unfolded as it did. In the case of slavery, it has been too readily assumed that resistance to emancipation in the 19th century America was based simply on the economic interest of those who owned slaves, when in fact abolitionists were hated even in the states that had outlawed slavery. And emancipation was feared even by white Southerners who owned no slaves, who were a majority of white Southerners. Did you hear what I just said? I had to wait just a moment to let that. I was like, wait a minute, what? I did read that. It says here, and emancipation was feared even by white Southerners who owned no slaves, who were a majority of white Southerners. So a majority of white Southerners did not own slaves, people. They didn't own them. When slavery is viewed in worldwide perspective, still more common beliefs crumble when confronted with the facts of history. The truth should need no apology, but the truth about the history of slavery is urgently needed for reasons that go beyond historical accuracy. Both the present and the future are at stake when we look at the past. What lessons we draw from that past depend on whether it is viewed narrowly or against the broader background of world history. Exactly. From a narrow perspective, the lesson that some draw from the history of slavery automatically conceived of as the enslavement of blacks by whites. That's what I thought. Is that white people were or are uniquely evil. I did not think that, but a lot of people do. Against the broader background of world history, however, a very different lesson might be that no people of any color can be trusted with unbridled power over any other people. For such power has been grossly abused by whatever race, class, or political authority has held that power, whether under ancient despotism, despotism, or modern totalitarianism, as well as under serfdom, slavery, or other forms of oppression. It was not because people thought slavery was right that it persisted for thousands of years. It persisted largely because people did not think about the rightness or wrongness of it at all. In very hierarchical societies, where most people were born into their predetermined niches in the social complex, slaves were simply at the bottom of a long continuum of varying levels of subordination based on birth. Even in colonial America, white indentured servants were a major part of the population, and they were auctioned off just like black slaves. It was the rise of modern free societies and their accompanying ideologies in the West which made slavery stand out in stark contrast, and it was the emergence of a general questioning of institutions and beliefs in the 18th century, also in the West, that brought slavery into question. Once that happened, slavery could not stand up under moral scrutiny. Outside the West, it did not have to, at least not until after the spread of Western ideas of individual freedom belatedly took hold in some other societies. That such an institution could last so long unchallenged on every inhabited continent is a chilling example of what can happen when people simply do not think. Germans in history. Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English. I didn't know that. French, Spanish, or Italian. But the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rule of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, it has colored the way Germans have been seen since then, as well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. German intellectual figures, social traditions, and political movements in centuries past that were once seen in the context of their own times are now often seen as precursors of Nazi totalitarianism or of the Holocaust. Was all the German history leading up to Hitler? Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale? The collectivization of Germans in the minds of others has had major consequences in the real world, quite aside from its impact on intellectual conceptions of this people. At the end of the Second World War, millions of people of German ancestry living outside the Reich in various parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were sent, quote-unquote, back to Germany, even though many of these families had been living where they were for centuries, and many of the individuals sent, quote-unquote, back to Germany had in fact never seen Germany. Wow. I can't even imagine that. Winston Churchill protested these, in quotes, mass expulsions of millions of Germans on a scale grievous and undreamed of, end quote, and said, in quotes, "We must banish revenge against an entire race for our minds," end quote. In order to assess the 12 fateful years of the Nazi regime and its relationship to German culture and history in general, we must first review that history and that culture. Germans as a people have extended well beyond the boundaries of present-day Germany, not only in Europe, but in overseas settlements in the Western Hemisphere and as far away as Australia. The extent to which these far-flung settlements could be considered German and how long depends, of course, on the extent to which German culture persisted among them and whether or not that culture was linked to the German nation state. To assess that, we need to see, at least in outline, some of the prominent features of the culture and values historically associated with Germans. Moreover, the features of German culture stand out in sharper relief against the cultures of the surrounding peoples, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe or the British and French to the west. Germans before Germany. Germans were recognized as a distinct people as far back as Roman times, many centuries before there was a nation-state of Germany. Like other peoples, Germans evolved socially, culturally, and politically within the influence and constraints of geography and the imperatives of other peoples. The great cultural impact of the Roman Empire, which left enduring marks on the development of Western Europe, reached what is now France long before it reached what is now Germany, simply because the mountains that impeded movement into Central Europe and Eastern Europe were more formidable than the geographic obstacles to expansion into Western Europe. The great East-West divide that has split Europe culturally and economically for thousands of years since then goes back to the intractable facts of geography as the arena within which human achievements developed and spread or failed to develop and failed to spread. Eastern Europe has differed from Western Europe not only in that the West was part of the Roman Empire for centuries and the East was not, but also that the many geographic advantages of Western Europe were lacking in much of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Mineral deposits such as iron ore and coal, crucial to the Industrial Revolution, have been more abundant in Western Europe. The milder climate of Western Europe, warmed by the Gulf Stream, has meant that its rivers have remained flowing when those of Eastern Europe are frozen for months at a time. Moreover, the navigable waterways of Western Europe empty into the open ocean, providing access to the trade routes of the world, while many of the rivers of Eastern Europe, even when flowing, flow into lakes or inland seas. Being part of the Roman Empire meant that Western Europe had not only a common language, Latin, but a literate language. Centuries before there were written versions of the various Slavic languages of Eastern Europe, written words have been essential to science, scholarship, and literature, as well as facilitating economic development, all of which flourished in Western Europe for centuries before they had a comparable impact in Eastern Europe. This meant that there was an accumulation of centuries of literature and philosophy, science, history, and other fields in the languages of Western Europe and of Germany before any such literature began to be developed in Eastern Europe. Don't go hang, until we meet again, love you, mean it.